Um, Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Bridget. I'm introducing Dr. David Quigley today, who is an assistant teaching professor here in the computer science department, working and teaching at the intersection of machine learning, data science, and human-computer interaction. His research aims to understand how learners use digital tools and how we can use design and data-driven personalization to improve equity in the learning experience. And we're going to hear a little bit more from him now as I pass it on to him. David, you should have screen share access if that's
I do.
preferred.
That is a plan.
Okay, perfect.
All right, that's up. Blah, blah, blah. Let me adjust this, pull up the chat too, so you can back channel things at me there as well. Hello, everyone. As Bridget mentioned, I am David Quigley. And I am going to talk to you today. So my talk is understanding student use of digital learning tools. But I have a little bit of I don't know, I guess a backdoor agenda, I would say. So I wanted to go through, in particular, walk through my PhD research, because I was a PhD student here in the department before I graduated, before I got this teaching professor job here. And so I wanted to share with y'all some of my experience as a grad student, as a PhD student here, some of the things that I gained from being here at CU doing research, and sort of the ways that I picked it up. And in particular, I was a PhD student in computer science and in cognitive science. So it was the joint PhD program with cognitive science, which helps to shape some of the experience I have. And hoping we get to the time for this, I wanted to talk to you about my research going forward, which is sort of a new direction for me as I have come into this teaching professor position and am starting to start a new trajectory. And we'll talk more about that. By all means, like I said, I have the chat open. You can drop questions in there. Interrupt me with questions if you feel like you need to. Otherwise, we'll have plenty of time at the end. I'm hoping if we're hitting 6 o'clock and I'm just continuing to talk on, please interrupt me so that we have time for questions. All right. So my particular PhD thesis was a learning analytics approach to scaffolding scientific modeling in the classroom. Been a while since I really said that. And in particular, I was working with Tammy Sumner here in the department and in cognitive science, as well as a large team. And our particular process was this co-design process that is, really bakes user-centered design and bringing users into the fold of being involved in the design from start to finish. So I was working with these folks here at one point, and the team changed from year to year, but over a several year process, developing out more than just tools that we're going to talk about, but an entire high school biology curriculum that was sort of deeply digital, focused on learning in that environment. So we had research scientists and professor folks, PhD students like myself and a couple of others. We had teachers, we had folks at the district level, all working together towards this objective of designing an entire year of curriculum. Now, where did I pick up these skills? Part of it was just from the lab experience, right? Working with these particular professors, such as Tammy and Bill Penwell here Bill Penwell here, who's over in the School of Ed. But I also learned them from my classes here. So 5839 is user-centered design here at CU. Great course where we learn some of these co-design and user-centered design principles. There's approaches in the School of Education that dovetail with this quite nicely. I was looking this up. I didn't take this course because it didn't exist. I had a special topics course back when I was studying back in 2013, 2014, whenever I took it. But these days it's a class about introduction to disciplined inquiry. So it's doing this inquiry research in a structured and disciplined way. Right? And so that comes with that cognitive science dual degree. So in particular, I was a part of I was working focused on my PhD on one unit looking at the students learning ecosystems on one particular part of it where they were building scientific models of their local ecosystems. So their end objective was to build a model of the local ecosystems, what organisms existed there, what resources existed there, things like that, and the interactions therein, with the end objective of choosing a tree to plant somewhere in their community, usually on their school grounds, or perhaps in a park or something like that. So should they plant the white ash? Should they plant the English oak? Should they plant these other trees? All depended on what information they found about their local ecosystem. So to support students in building these models, we built a tool called EcoSurvey, where they, what do you know, went out and surveyed their ecosystem, their local ethosystem, and documented it here in a structured way so that they could build these graph-based models. And there were many different screens, as you can expect in a complex modeling tool, but I broke down both the process of modeling as well as my analysis of student modeling into different practices. So they would construct new elements, add new things to their ecosystem model. They would review the current state of models, look at what organisms have been added, what cards was the term we had. They would revise their things, so they would edit pieces based on new information, perhaps adding a relationship or removing something that they found was false. They would iterate back and forth through all of these steps, and they would look at the model to try and build this picture and use that as part of their argument for which tree they chose to plant. So students were building these really cool models. That was the objective. And my research started with just trying to understand how to build this tool and how students were using it. And we focused on the idea of a data-driven improvement process. So this is a particular learning analytics cycle, looking at how we do this sort of thing in the scope of learning and education, starting with studying and understanding the users, studying and looking at the data that they generate, distilling those data into particular metrics and insights, and then developing interventions based on the results that you found. And this parallels a lot of other data cycles that we see. These skills come from classes we have here in computer science. 5502 is one. I took that my first semester here at CU, and it was really helpful in presenting me with these sort of perspectives. Machine learning was helpful in especially the distillation of the data into results and understanding what's going on, and other data science classes. We have some at the undergraduate level too. So in particular, in our first year, we built out this system and we deployed it in classrooms. So we deployed with 3 different teachers who have been codenamed Anderson, Baker, and Chavez, and in 10 different classrooms among those 3 teachers, with a total of 262 students. And in the district that we were working in, 70% of the population is registered as being in low socioeconomic status, and it is registered as a diverse district according to certain national metrics. Overall, we found that among these 10 high school classrooms, they built 9 different models, which featured 586 organisms, not necessarily unique because there was overlap between the classes. They tended to find, oh, ash trees are all across the district. And there were 545 interactions, and we had over 3,000 different clickstream actions that came through. Right? And I was particularly focused on a few different ways of analyzing this. So the first analysis was trying to understand the models themselves. How good were the models that they built? And we wanted to try and build a generalized perspective of what makes a good model. So we thought about some generalized metrics of graphs. How many elements are there? How many components? How many connections? How many interactions? What's the density of interactions to components? And how does that density vary from model to model, or from component to component? If you have a few connections to all pieces, it's pretty well connected. If you have one piece that's centrally connected and connects to 50 other things, and then those are just otherwise unconnected, then it's not a very rich representation of something like an ecosystem. So overall, we found a large amount of variance in these students' models. And in breaking this down, like I said, there were only 9 models. Anderson decided to merge their 2 classes, but interestingly enough, that boiled down to this approximately the same number of students. So it was pretty comparable there. But we see that Anderson's students put in a lot of organisms, a lot of interactions, and had some more interconnectivity in there. And we found some statistical significance in this. Where did I learn to do all of these kind of things, to build these kinds of models, to understand the statistical significance? In my classes. Data mining and machine learning were great. There's several classes in education and psychology that are focused on statistical analysis and statistical methods. And these were really helpful in building the idea of more than just, oh, I can produce numbers and they don't mean anything, to determining that there was true inequity in the student experience. There was statistically significant inequity between Anderson's students, Baker's students, and Chavez's students. Similarly, we looked at how the students' click streams revealed their engagement with modeling practices. And even just looking here at the just the raw count of interactions, we saw that Anderson's students tended to do more of everything, which obviously would lead to bigger models. And Baker's students didn't do very many things. In particular, Baker's students did do some adding of elements and looking at them, but they really skipped that revision step and use step. And so they weren't finishing through their models and thinking about how they might be robust enough to prove whether a tree was right or wrong. So we were able to characterize models and students' modeling practices. And we also use this in that co-design user-centered design process as a baseline of the models and activities that we see. So to move on beyond the first year, we decided to focus on the idea of scaffolding the student experience, which is an idea much like scaffolding for a building or some other sort of construction or painting job or whatever. You are providing supports in place so that students can achieve more than they would otherwise without the scaffolds. And as they gain the skill, as they build the tower, as it were, in the metaphor, you start to remove the scaffolding because you no longer need it to access the greater heights. Right? So this idea in particular, again, not a course I actually took. It was in that special topics course that I really focused on. But classroom interactions over in the School of Education focuses a lot on this perspective of how students learn and how we can support students learning with tools. Right. So to update our tool, we came up with a new perspective on interaction, thinking about the fact that if students didn't naturally see their final graphs, then they weren't worrying about that aspect. So we incorporated the graph view into the basic foundation. Instead of that view of, one card after the other, we worried about having the graph view front and center, and you could click on the elements and see their detailed cards and then edit those. Similarly, as I said, we saw differences in the density and the goodness of their models. And we found that there was a lot of basically junk data in the models that they made because it was an open-ended text box. So literally the change we made was going from an open-ended text box for relationships and role to drop-down boxes. So now if they wanted to add a relationship, they would say, I have a relationship to this particular element. And so they had to pick things that already existed. Right? And in particular, one of the relationships we added was I don't know. So they could add in, I think there's a connection. I don't know how it falls into these terms. Right? And then there was also that open-ended tagging. But we ran a study with this in a different group. We had a larger cohort this time, 11 different teachers running 35 different classes, and they built 35 different class models, which had many more organisms and interactions. And interestingly enough, we saw some significant differences in the models themselves and some of the measures of goodness in terms of the number of organisms and number of interactions. So they were building larger models that had more connections. An interesting thing here was the idea of orphaned cards. So we were worried about making sure, just like in the real world ecosystem, everything has to interact with some other element in the ecosystem, even if it's, you know, a plant that is getting something from the soil and getting sunshine, that needs to be documented. And in many cases, there are consumers that rely on those plants for shelter, for food, for things like that. So the idea of having something in the ecosystem that is not connected to anything else didn't make sense. But we didn't see a significant change there, which was interesting. Now, as I said, I'm interested in the ways that we can use data to understand these inequities and these issues and use design to improve them. So one of the big things we were worried about was this, in version 1, this imbalance in the types of relationships that they had. So they had a true majority of their samples were just interacting predator-prey models. So they weren't really building robust models looking at the entirety of interactions among the ecosystem. They were just thinking about predator-prey. Whereas in version 2, all we really changed was the ability to have the drop down, but suddenly they understood these were the kinds of relationships they could have, and we saw much more equity that was also significantly improved there. So we saw the addition of students using this idea of mutual beneficence. The unknown wasn't really used very much, whereas it was pretty major in version 1. So that was all improving. So we were able to characterize students' models and their modeling practices. And we discovered some limits to this generalized approach to characterizing models. But we started to develop these deeper measures. And we saw with the iterative design that we saw improvements in the way the models were balanced, but size and complexity were still lacking. So here we went into a third study with a few more teachers and more classrooms, some of whom had overlap there. And in this particular version, we focused on trying to create a student feedback dashboard. So we wanted students to see in real time, what things have you done and what things have you not done? What things do you still need to do? So they were able to see, oh, I've added one component. I've done a lot of reviewing other people's components or my own components. No edits. I've only looked at the sort of graph view once or twice. And how well have I gone back and forth between elements? And then we provided this targeted feedback based on what the student should be doing next. So we saw it didn't have a huge impact on the models themselves, which was a little disappointing, but it's a reality. Right? So we saw maybe this sort of regression towards the mean with how complex their models were. But interestingly, we did find that we were able to reduce that between teacher variance. So we said that some students were building great, rich, robust models and engaging with modeling effectively, and other students were not. We were able to reduce the amount of variance in engaging with the practices attributable to the teacher. So it was about equal or reduced on many different things. In particular, this iteration was greatly improved. So students were doing a better job of going to look at the model as a whole, reflecting on it and fixing things and going back and forth between tasks. All right. So we were also interested in the impact of our metric, of our feedback. So we developed this metric, which was based on a decay model, thinking about how impactful, giving the feedback an impact score from 1 to 0, which was based on the number of actions they had taken since looking at the feedback, and did they take the action we recommended, and a decay factor. And we found that there were many students, first of all, there were many students that got eliminated because they had been modeling successfully, or because they never went and looked at the feedback at all. So that eliminated a good number of student interactions. But we found that either students would successfully engage with the practice pretty much immediately, or students would literally never go do the thing that we recommended. So there was this pretty strong dichotomy there, which was interesting, thinking about the different types of users that we saw. So that was something we could dig more into. Another thing we found, we ran some student interviews. Again, things that we cover in classes like user-centered design and some of the classes in the School of Education. And it was fascinating that we were able to figure out that students had sort of this latent understanding of what was important in modeling, and it was embedded in the context of building a model of their local ecosystem. So when the interviewer, me, asked a student, have you been making models this past year? The student said, basically, no, we've been thinking about tree profiles. Later, when I had the question, what would you say is the purpose of EcoSurvey, the tool we had, the modeling tool we had, they described the modeling of the process of modeling down to a T, to learn how different species, a tree or animals, interact with each other, and to learn the relationships they have. If you just replace the word learn with the word model, that's what they were doing. And so they understood the purpose of this whole thing very succinctly and very effectively. They just couldn't put the label modeling onto it, which was fascinating. So that was something that we wanted to take forward into future units within the biology classroom to help generalize the idea of modeling. We also saw this very interesting connection looking at those interviews. How well did the students understand? Did they have a generalized understanding of model, sort of this contextual understanding, or no understanding at all? And how well did that connect with their use of the practices? And we found especially the students that did more reflection on the model as a whole, more of that use action, and the students who just were engaged with the task more thoroughly were the ones who had a deeper understanding. So it was fascinating here, thinking about sort of understanding models and modeling practices, showing the power of iteration to understand what has a difference, what has an impact and what doesn't, and to sort of build these models of student understanding. So before I move on briefly, do folks have things they want me to clarify? Okay, cool. That wasn't an excuse to drink water, not at all. Hi, Seung-wook.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, is the human interaction so I have a question about that because the personal characteristic is very different. So how to solve the different every each person personality, the using of many people, how to solve that? Because I can understand that it is human is hard to understand, I feel. So every
Certainly
each
true.
person, each person, depending on their situation or their education or something, many factors affected their act. So how to handling their situation or the project?
Yeah. So first of all, that's a very good question. And it's sort of something outside the scope of what we were really worrying about, right? Different students are going to engage with the tool somewhat differently. And you can't, unless you mandate it as a rule and give them grades based on it, you can't say everyone has to add 5 elements to this. Although interestingly enough, there were teachers that did make that rule and not everyone did it. And they just didn't get a 100% grade. And that's just the way students behave. Everyone will engage with the task differently. The thing that I was particularly worried about was the idea of creating equity in opportunity and experience. So people were going to behave differently. The thing that I was worried about, that we were worried about, was this idea that if you have a good teacher, you're going to have a great time and learn a lot. If you have a bad teacher, you're not going to learn a thing. So that's where we were particularly worried about this teacher variance, mapping which teacher they have to different outcomes in terms of engagement with modeling as a scientific practice. And we saw this reduction on some of the most outstanding areas of variance in version 1. Does that help? Okay, Spencer.
Thank you. I had, to that point, I have a question about, I guess, the technical component of this. Was this an online or offline solution? And like, did the school provide computers to students? You noted that we have a particularly low socioeconomic space. I wonder, like, do students have internet at home? Was that considered in your data?
It's a very good question. So yeah, that certainly is something that comes into play, just the technical complexity and need for access to a tool for supporting students. And in this particular one, so there were 2 different versions. One was technically built in JavaScript. This one was built in Django, which is like a Python web interface thing. So they were both online tools. And they were both cloud-based, so just hosted them on S3 because we could get the hosting for free through the university, right? But just whatever worked for the scale that we needed. But that was certainly a consideration. That idea of who has access to what devices was much more of a concern. Since we were developing this curriculum that was entirely focused on digital access, so this wasn't the only digital activity students were doing. There was other stuff where they were running things that were like the PhET simulations you may know about, some things like that. So it actually was part of the curriculum that we embedded laptop carts in those science classrooms. So they had approximately 1 laptop per student, exclusively within the classroom. So it was a room-based CART situation. It was fascinating too, just to get outside the scope of this, working in a school and in classrooms, and especially in K-12, gets really complicated with the fact that you're embedded within a school, embedded within a district. And that both impacts some of the modeling that you do. So you have to take these courses like multi-level modeling and things like that to understand what's happening at the teacher level, what's happening here. You can learn things without classes, but I had to learn those particular skills for those purposes. But also things like, well, we can't do eco-survey today because my principal has decided that the English language arts class needs the laptops more than we do. So they took my laptops that are exclusively dedicated to my class away from me. And so I would be set up to go do an observation. Cool, what's up? Yeah, we're not doing eco-survey today. They took the laptops. Sorry. I would burn time going down to a large urban school district in our region, and then drive back to campus. So it's fascinating. Yeah,
I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, so my question is, I once did a study on a curriculum design by things, and I found that more questionnaires that are multiple choice are being more answered than open-ended questions. I'm not sure if it implies that from your study right here that the version 2 with the choices would like suggesting like a suggestive answer would be better for participants to learn other than think freely about yourself.
So the main thing here, like the argument that we had, version 1 had the open-ended free response text box, and it would populate with previous answers. So there were some suggestions of things. If you started typing the word pray would show up. But when we created these, when we created the closed-ended list, it was, we made that list, and then we took the options that students chose in the first one and mapped them to the same thing. So we have this predator-prey relationship in the purple in this particular chart. And it didn't matter if they said praise or preys upon or is eaten by or various things. We mapped that to predator-prey relationships. And if the closed-ended had not had an impact, then we wouldn't have seen a significant loss in the relative weight of that category. But the thing that we saw was when we presented students with the scientifically motivated terms, they understood, oh, this is a kind of relationship, more than just predator-prey. It's providing non-food based support or things like that.
I see. So another question is from the version 2, which has a scientific term right there. Did the students learn more from the choices compared to the first version where it was an open-ended?
Did they actually learn more is something that's beyond the scope of what we could tease apart. I did interviews after each round with some groups of students, but I wasn't asking questions that were that fine detailed about their understanding of types of relationships within an ecosystem. I was worried about the generalized process of scientific modeling. So basically we didn't capture those data. And it just, in my head, would be very difficult to successfully tease apart.
Were any grades of the students at the end of the term considered in this research?
No.
No.
We did not add any element of grades in terms of what we analyzed. We provided some loose recommendations to the things that teachers should be able to expect of their students, but we didn't provide formal assessments like exams or things like that. And we we also didn't, I focused on interviews for the building a understanding of students learning.
Oh, so the evaluation of what students learned, I saw a slide right there about how much students learn compared to each strategy right there. So that was from interviews, right?
So this slide in particular focuses on how did their depth of understanding as demonstrated in the interviews, how does that map to how many of each type of practice they did. So a student who showed a generalized understanding of modeling, did they do many or few create actions, many or few review actions, many or few edit actions, so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Spencer.
Hey, thanks. So it occurs to me, you say that we're trying to make sure there's equity as long as regardless of how effective the teacher is at educating. Were there any like measures of these teachers being effective, or was that something
We were measuring the effectiveness of the class creating these models, because the models were the primary output. Like I said, we didn't look at grades, we didn't look at standardized test scores, any of that kind of stuff. The model was the object that we used to understand this. And so the main thing we were looking at was, there was the models themselves, that was one measure, and there was, via the click stream, their engagement with the practices. This idea of, did they create things? Did they review things? Did they look at actually using their model? Things like that. And, I said we were looking at teacher variance, and teacher variance doesn't just come down to the teacher being quote unquote good or quote unquote bad. It can boil down to things like the teacher had their laptop cart taken away from them half the time, so they couldn't do the entire activity. Those kinds of things exist, and they still boil down to that level of everyone at this school or with this teacher or whatever gets that sort of experience. But that's why you get that hierarchical model.
Okay, appreciate it.
I want to make sure I get to my other section here. We can continue to talk and ask questions. So this is what I did several years ago. But I also wanted to make sure I did take some time to talk about what I'm looking at doing now, because this is the kind of thing I'm actually recruiting for. I'm not embedding in K-12 classrooms. I'm a teaching professor, not a tenure track professor. I don't have large grants funding the ability to build these large inquiry-based projects and look in K-12 classrooms. So what I'm interested in looking at is the differences in students across different interaction types here at CU, but trying to generalize that. Because I'm interested in the ways that different populations of students might behave. And this is a project that's very much in its infancy. It's something that I'm starting to work on now and actually get IRB approval and all those kind of things. So if this is something that interests you, this is something I'm actively recruiting for. But what I don't have is money. But if you're interested in this, I would love to chat with you, would love to work with you. But the main thing we're thinking about here is the fact that we all have perhaps this antiquated view of the idea of traditional learning, be it in the K-12 setting or in the college classroom, but I'm focused on college classrooms, of sitting in spaces with these people. So we have the idea of lectures and lecture halls, of people perhaps engaging in some discussion and things like that, but working with the instructor in real time, going through interactions on a whiteboard or on a PowerPoint or things like that. You have the idea of discussion and group-based work, doing things like collaborating in small group spaces, perhaps around shared tables and things like that, spaces that are designed to support that well. And then you have things like lab classes, which recitations start to get into that kind of field too, where folks are engaging with the practices involved in the classroom. So science classrooms are big for this, especially sort of physical sciences classes where you test how this chemical interacts with that chemical, or how this particular element being moved at this speed interacts with that one, and understanding, physics and things of that sort. All right, so we have this model of traditional learning, and a lot of learning theory has been based on these particular ways of interacting. But we have been building, more than just in the past few years, but for many years have been building spaces to try and make online interactions that mimic this. And I think we probably all experienced this around 2020 spring with a little thing called COVID. And suddenly our lives switched from being in this traditional setting, for the most part, to some sort of remote setting, which I also label synchronous. So your classes are designed to try and be the same, right? You still want to have students there doing a lecture, or students in breakout rooms doing small group work and things like that, comparing and contrasting. Labs are some of the things that tend to be the hardest to do in this sort of remote way, where you have to create digital facsimiles of the physical activities, or embed the physical activities in the student experience. Jared?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what do you anticipate finding?
I will get to that, but I'm not done explaining the different groups that I'm interested in, right? So we have traditional things. We had this sort of remote synchronous learning type thing, but we have other models too that exist, right? We have that sort of free-form online learning where you have recorded lectures and you embed them in a platform like Coursera, and you make them available, perhaps for free, perhaps for cost, whatever. But students are engaging with tools and things that are automated in many cases. So they have automated quizzes and they can try them until they get them right. And they interact with only these digital tools, because you can't embed any resources in the student's home or anything like that. And there's a fourth one that doesn't get talked about, but I find really fascinating. And it's the idea of semi-synchronous learning. And we have some classes at the graduate level here that you may have taken, where it offers the ability for you to not just sit in the classroom on Zoom, but to watch the recorded lectures week by week and keep up with the class. And so there's no expectation of the student sitting in this spot, even virtually, at this time, and so you can talk to them, but you do expect them by next week to have accomplished these three things. And Spencer popped in the chat, when I first graduated and started working on things, I was working with the post-bac program here at CU, right? And that's what really inspired me to think about this as a different and more unique model, because we have these students who are engaging completely online, but at their own time. And so there is still that real-time-ish feedback, like homeworks and exams and things like that. And there's discussion with peers and things of that sort, but through asynchronous platforms like Piazza or whatever other du jour discussion point there is. And so I'm interested in trying to understand the differences between these kinds of populations. In particular, there's a few, these are very, very tentative research questions, but I'm interested in the ways that students in hybrid classes interact with the tools, Canvas and things like that, when they are traditional learning students who in theory sit in the classroom versus remote students. And my expectation is that you can, there's not good measures of how students engage digitally with the traditional classes, but if a student is a remote student, you can measure sort of the time from the element existing to engagement to look at that. I'm interested in how these populations compare, especially to the semi-synchronous learning populations. But they, as the postbaccalaureate program tends to target, these are pretty fundamentally different populations. The post-bac support is designed to support folks who are working part-time or full-time, have other objectives in their life that make attending class part-time or full-time on a regular schedule untenable. Perhaps folks with young children or folks with careers that go 9 to 5, and they can't take every class in an evening block, things like that. People who are trying to do that career transition rather quickly so they can dedicate their whole weekend to doing it. Whatever it is. So I'm interested for that particular thing. I'm mostly just interested in trying to figure out what differences exist in more of a data mining approach. I don't have any particular theories about what will correlate with success versus not success in different populations there. So does that answer your question that you had several minutes ago, Jared?
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on what you think the outcome might have been.
Yeah, it's a good question. But it necessitates the understanding this theory that I'm trying to build, that there's more of a spectrum of learning experiences. So that's the materials I had. I'll go ahead and keep screen sharing if folks want me to hop back to things. But thank you all for your time. Thanks for coming. And like I said, I'm happy to chat further. I'm David.Quigley at Colorado. You can email me. I'm on campus most days because I teach Monday through Friday. Spencer, there was a question.
I was going to ask, what's your preferred contact method? This sounds really cool. I have some ideas for it.
If you don't email me and like you just stop by my office or something, we can have a good conversation and I won't remember it in a week. I will remember the conversation. I won't remember the action items. Okay. So email or something of the sort like that is good. I'm getting better, I think, at managing it, but you can poke me again. If I didn't say something, poke me again. I may have missed it. My inbox is a bit of a mess right now.
Understandable. Thanks.
Ashkit? Sorry.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, great presentation, first of all, and really enjoyed the kind of things that you've been doing, especially with the K-12 part. That is pretty interesting. My question is that the kind of things that you're working on right now, are they any domain specific? Because like you were doing K-12 with biology, there could be things that can be done with physics, computer science, sorry, not computer science, chemistry, anything, for even mathematics for that matter. So is there any domain specific knowledge that you are looking for, or is it like anybody can, uptake anything that they're interested in teaching, sort of?
In that data mining sort of way, like I said, my current efforts at the collegiate level are very much in their infancy. In that data mining sort of way, I'm interested at trying to see if different populations in terms of their majors and domains and things like that have different patterns. And that might have to boil down to understanding the structure of class design within and between majors, between disciplines. I have some loose expectations of things like arts and sciences classes have more regular things where you're checking in on how this reading's going every week, whereas in my classes in particular, we have these larger milestones that take several weeks. And so I expect to see, like, if I look at my classes versus one other person's classes, I expect my students to be more bursty, to have not looked at Canvas for a week and a half and then have logged in and then logged in again and gone to Piazza every day for the weekend and the next day before the deadline, kind of thing. So It's the kind of thing I expect. I don't know if it will correlate with good or bad outcomes. I don't know what defines that other than grades so far, but it's something I'm looking to sort out. And
That
at the
makes
moment,
sense.
too, with that question, this idea of semi-synchronous learning, I'm
Right.
currently planning to focus on compare and contrast with comparable computer science classes. So how does CS Postbac 1300 compare to CSCI 1300? So on and
Okay.
so forth, because there I have that very strong thread of this is nigh identical content. It's at CU. It's not the same humans, but it's the same course number and all of these things. They're designed by the curriculum committee to be the same. How do the
Right.
students treat them differently?
Makes sense. That explains. Thank you.
Although I loosely understand that there are other semi-synchronous things supported on campus. I know that there are other programs. I don't know where they live. So, is it mechanical that has one? Is it, the theater department that has one? I have no idea. But I'm
that makes
setting
sense.
out to learn.
But like let's say your research actually turns out, or you can prove that the research that you're doing is actually getting making students learn better. I guess that's the final objective. Then it's possible to pitch in the idea to other departments as well as maybe as some tool. Who knows?
Yeah. Right now I'm in more of the phase of trying to define the differences to that compare and contrast type thing, more like the year one study that I was doing. So that we then have a foundation upon which we can design for improved student experiences.
That's fair. If I may ask, can I go ahead and ask another question if there are no other questions?
Does someone else have something pressing? All right, yeah, go ahead.
So this is interesting because my mother is also a teacher and she's been working on this very interesting thing. So this is semi-synchronous learning that you're working on, and what she's sort of developing is some sort of self-learning modules. Like it's basically like she's given not just videos but books also, which essentially serve as modules that any person can learn from in completeness. Like they don't really need an instructor even. Like everything from the exercises to the explanations, and what they're trying to achieve is to even get doubts, somewhat expected doubt sort of things that they can add in, such that even that is kind of complete on its own. And it's especially useful for areas, let's say in India, there are areas that do not have internet or even probably electricity for that matter. So it's pretty useful that way. So do you have any sort of, anything that you're working on or any plans or
so my main sort of one theory that I've built on is the fact that online learning is not considered at the same level of rigor as these others. Semi-synchronous and remote and traditional learning are all linked to you being in Dr. Quigley's class from August through December of 2022. And so they all carry the same merit towards a final degree. If you're doing something in that non-observed way, and that's the main thing, is there a that's two things. Is there a instructor, a teacher with their finger on the pulse of what's happening at any given time, giving the students individualized feedback? And then there's the idea of the cohort. So semi-synchronous learning still gives you that access to, you've got these people you've worked with for 16 weeks, so you can develop relationships, you can still get group projects very effectively. In a thing like Coursera, there is so much drop off that you just can't make those group kinds of things work very effectively. But I applaud and think that there is great merit to the effort of building an online setting that gives you the same level of rigor and the same amount of sort of coordinated experience as these others.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's good. I don't have anything like truly unique to bring to that, at least not yet.
Sure, who knows? Yeah, thanks for your response. Thank you.
But yeah. Do other folks have questions? Here, I'll go ahead and just for the sanity of it, I'll pop my
Okay. I
email
have
here in
one
chat.
quick question. I think I heard that just for these settings, the three categories would be traditional, semi-synchronous, and online learning. So just to clarify, the metrics that we're trying to collect for this study would be the amount of interactions in Canvas, something like that. Is that what we're looking for?
So it also will need to take into account the temporal measures of not just you clicked 10 different buttons, but you clicked a button every day for 10 days versus you went and did all 10 things on day 10. So that sort of spaced versus massed activity is one thing. That's a pretty foundational learning theory, is the idea of if you engage with it again and again and again, spaced out over time, you get more flexible and more durable knowledge than if you cram before the exam in this massed practice setting.
Yeah, because from this experiment, I can imagine if every student takes only one types of courses, but if a student takes a semi-synchronous class and a traditional class altogether, I'm not sure how to quantify the access pattern of a single student, because it's a mixture of different things right there.
So to me, it would be looking at, at that very student level, do they do the same kinds of things in Canvas with their semi-synchronous class as they do with their traditional class? I don't have a good prediction of yes or no. I think the answer is closer to it depends. Different students will behave in different ways. But that in and of itself, I think, is contributing new information to the world. And one thing I wanted to point out too is the idea of being a traditional student, but not putting your meat into a classroom and meet space, but joining from your whatever, but still doing that joining rhythmically at the correct time, the time that the class is assigned and things like that. I do expect this will be much more comparable to semi-synchronous learning, and I expect that we will see some of those masked versus spaced effect practices. And when there's, for example, in my machine learning class, it's built to be pretty flexible. You can be there in person if you're registered for it that way. You can attend remotely if you need to. You can make it function semi-synchronously if you need to, sort of on the, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you've got to engage before the next class. So I'm particularly interested in the way that works.
Another quick question. Are you interested in analyzing the Canvas logs from the servers of CU?
I am actively in talks with OIT of how that might work. And then I'm going to look at the IRB approval process, because the first thing I want to do is make sure I keep everyone's data safe and secure, and I work with it in ethically correct ways, because I don't want anyone's passwords to get leaked because of me, right? But I'm interested in that as an approach, yes. A thing I'm mostly hoping to do that in a aggregate anonymized way, but we'll see what proves possible. We'll see what proves useful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Actually.
Yeah, so I was just thinking when you said about being ethically correct, is there anything related to FERPA that we should keep in mind while developing any of these tools, or does FERPA doesn't even come into picture?
Yeah, it comes into picture. When I was doing the K-12 stuff, you run into FERPA things at that level as well. The biggest piece there is the idea that you are engaging in the classroom and you are engaging with what the teacher is doing anyway, and you can give the students the ability to opt out of the data portion of things. And
Okay.
that's hugely important. And so
Okay.
similarly, I'm expecting to perhaps have some similar things in the CU process. I don't know what that's going to mean. We'll find out, but
Did
Yeah.
children actually opt out of it though? Like given the option?
yeah, some
On the
did.
K-12.
Not the majority of them for sure.
Right.
But a significant group of folks opted to have their data not considered. So the data still have to exist because the teacher
Right.
is using EcoSurvey, the platform, or whatever other tool for the purpose of their classroom. And so the teacher needs to be able to review them. But we had to set up specific stages in our analysis scripts that when we pull down the data, we exclude these IDs before we run the analysis.
Makes sense. Okay. That answers. Thank you.
So we're hitting 6:15 too. I put my contact information in chat. I don't know if there was anything else. Bridget, do you have a wrap up?
I was just gonna say thank you for
Thank you.
presenting this information. It's been really interesting for me as well. I'm sure all the students found it useful. So thank you for that. And thank
Thanks
you
for the
all.
opportunity and thanks for participating, folks. I enjoyed the questions and would love to have more.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining.
Good night.
Thank you.